Welcome, my friend. You're watching the Bible study.
You have entered the Bible study.
Here it is. The Bible study, mastering the Word of God, one book at a time. And by the way, you might have noticed Mark is looking a little bit more three-dimensional in this episode 5 of the Bible study.
The technology has increased where we're not in the same room, but it looks like we are.
No, he's here. It's not, it's not
we decided to dress the same, too.
It's not a Tupac thing. Mark Clark,
hologram.
Village Church, Vancouver.
Good to be here yet again. My
man,
favorite crew.
So good. Look at this. I can actually fist bump you.
That. I like it.
And if you're new to the Bible study, Mark's been on a ton. We have other Bayside pastors on here. I'm Pastor Curt. Pastor Andrew's going to be on next week with Mark live, just like this. And here's the cool thing. We are in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians. I want you to open there now. Unless you're driving, don't open anything when you're driving. But if you're not, pull to the side. We're going to do an in-depth, verse-by-verse study of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, about the first 8 verses, maybe a little bit more. And here's how we do it. We go context. I'm going to talk about that. Then we're going to go through the verses, verse by verse. And then we're going to talk some bigger doctrinal issues, and we'll end with application. Context, theology, doctrine, and application. That's our order. Are you ready to go? Mark
Let's
Clark.
do it. Let's do it.
All right, context. Here we go. Chapter 5 is the sex talk.
Yes.
So we got to talk about the talk, because what happens here is the Corinthian church gets reported on, get tattletaled on, that there is division, there is instability, immaturity, and immorality, especially of the sexual kind. So if you're going to follow us the next few weeks in this, get ready for some PG-13, maybe put the ear muffins on the younger children, because we're going to get very honest. I got to tell you about a few questions here before I hand it over to Mark. First question is this. What does it mean to turn someone over to Satan? I'm sure Mark will have something to say about this. But by the end of this episode...
I'm sure you woke up this morning asking that very question.
Yes, that was a very relevant, felt need. What does it mean to turn someone over to Satan? Is what Paul recommends we do in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. I'm going to answer the question at the end of this episode, should your church have a go to Satan Sunday? So we have baby dedication Sunday, and we have baptism Sunday, and we have new members Sunday. Should your church add a go to Satan? Hey, at the end of October, bring your friend. Day. We're having a go to Satan Sunday.
August 31st.
I will answer that, but you got to stay tuned for the whole
thing.
Let me give you a little context here. First of all, who tattletaled on the Corinthians? Who told Paul there is some sexual sin in the camp? Well, apparently it was Chloe's household. That's who's identified. But we also know that a group of Corinthians asked Paul a list of questions. Would you please answer us this? So I think Chloe's household said, man, there's some major problems. And then they probably came to Paul and said, how do we handle this? We're kind of slow to handle this. We're reluctant to handle this. And you'll see what Paul says about being slow and reluctant to handle this. The report that Chloe gives indicates the Corinthian church was divided, morally compromised, and doing more harm than good in their gatherings. The apostle here comes back, and man, he is tired. He's wounded even. And he comes back with some very direct. I don't know if Paul is any more intense than he is in responding to this sexual immorality problem in the Corinthian church. Chapter 5 is where it begins. Like I said, it goes on for a few chapters, and he deals with incest, adultery, and a pattern of sexual immorality. Now, next question, and I'll hand it over to Marcus. Why so much sex talk in this particular book, 1 Corinthians? Well, the answer is contextual to their culture. Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, you've probably heard that name, was the deity, now this is the important part, that the city looked to for protection. So it just wasn't a party city for the sake of a party city. This is the misunderstanding of the Greek and Roman gods. It was an appeasement system. So they weren't just going, let's create a religion where we can have all sorts of sex with prostitutes. They had gotten into this system, this deceptive thinking of going, unless we engage in appeasing Aphrodite, our crops will not be protected. And here's an important one for Corinth. Our city will be under siege. So they're a seaport. They've got the Aegean Sea on one side and the Ionian Sea on the other side, which makes them wealthy, strategic, important, arrogant, and vulnerable. So every Greek city had a big high place called an Acropolis. Now, Acropolis was that's kind of where everyone ran to when they're being attacked. Like, it's easier to defend if you got the high ground, right? The Acropolis in 1 Corinthians is one of the most spectacular ones that the archaeologists tell you. And what they did is they built the temple of Aphrodite right on that Acropolis. So you understand the importance here. What they thought of as the most important part of their city, their defense, and what they thought of as the most important protector of their city, their goddess, it was all wrapped into one. So clearly, out of that temple system, some historians report up to 1,000 prostitutes at its heyday, coming down into a port city with sailors. Out of that system was birthed the church. So you would have actual temple workers being in this Corinthian church. You would have farmers that had gone and done immoral sexual acts to help their crops in this church. So the church, it seems, has bounced back into their culture instead of the biblical ethic, and Paul's dealing with that. And then one more last thing. Does this church have anything to do with us here, especially in California? Please. Do I even have to? I mean, I want to retitle this book, First Californians. What's happening in our culture sexually, ethically, and our desire to bounce back to that culture, defer to that culture, even though it's not good for us, is so relevant today. It's scary how much this book proves that God really did inspire the Bible. So having said that, Mark Clark, 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 8.
Great,
Let's go.
Great setup, great back. So my part in this is I start going through the text verse by verse and kind of expounding on it, extrapolating out from all that background that Curt just laid out. So he says in chapter 5, verse 1, it is actually reported. So as Curt talked about, someone has actually come back to Paul and said, hey, look, this is what's going on. You started this church. They're a gong show. They're all over the map. They're doing all kinds of craziness. They've become Christians, so they're part of the church, but they're not really living the life that God's asked them to live. So it's been reported to me that there's sexual immorality among you. So even just to understand why he's going to say a couple of things that he's going to say about sending a guy over to Satan and whatever, you got to understand that among you phrase, like underline that, click on that, whatever. Like, we are so individualized in our Christianity. We listen to our podcasts, we follow Jesus, we might have a little family and we all kind of believe the same stuff and share things, but to them, this among you was like when you became a Christian, you were part of the family of God. There was intimacy. You shared each other's stuff. You were in each other's space. It wasn't this kind of like, individualistic, capitalistic, like it was vastly different. And so everything he's gonna say sounds weird to us because he's gonna say things like hand a guy over to Satan or do church discipline on him or cast him out. And we're like, well, I don't understand why. What's the big deal? Like, does that mean delete him off Facebook? I don't even know this guy. I go to a church of, thousands and thousands of people. What does this mean?
If I see him at Whole Foods.
Yeah, am I supposed to run away from him? What's happening? Is this, and that's how, big mega churches have tried to apply this, and I think that can be dangerous. So, and I'll talk about this. But just that among you, we've got to understand. We probably don't even understand the among you, so the rest of it's not going to make a ton of sense. Like the among you, the one anotherness of this. Like I don't know if you guys talked about this yet in your context, but it's like Corinthians was a church. I don't know how many people were there. 100. Like it wasn't a big church. So we're not picturing thousands. These people knew each other. And yet, Paul says, it's been reported there is sexual immorality among you. And so this is a term that Paul uses. And this is, I did young adult ministry for 6 years. And so what tends to happen is I do a lot of premarital counseling. And of course I would tell kids, listen, here's what God designed marriage to be, male, female, in the context of marriage. And then when that's in place, then there's all kinds of details to talk about with that, how to make it good and how to make it an explorer and adventure and blah, blah, and what works for her, what works for him. There's a whole sessions we can do on that. But this is the only place for sexuality as God lays it out. And they would say, well, wait a minute. I remember dealing with so many young adults and they'd say, whoa, hold on. Show me that Bible verse. Show me that one. And I said, you guys are asking the wrong questions. See, everything from Genesis 1 and 2 till the end of the book of Revelation is built on, here's male and female. God literally does their wedding. It says, now leave and cleave, leave from your mother and father, cleave to your wife. You two become one, you multiply. There's this beautiful sexual vision and vocation given. And then in that moment, anything outside of that is now sexual immorality. So you don't need a list. And this is what's beautiful about him using this almost as a junk drawer category. Sexual immorality. He doesn't start listing out every single version of it, because if he did, then we'd just find one he didn't write, right? And then we'd go, okay, I can do that. I can get creative, all right? Paul would need, the whole book would just be like, and don't do this version and not with that.
Your Bible would be impossible to carry around.
It would be very long, because how many versions of sexual immorality can we come up with?
Right.
We obviously see this as a culture. So he doesn't get into that. He goes, hey, some of you are sexually immoral, which means some of you are having sex outside the context of male and female in marriage, and you got to knock it off. And then he does give one example, which is this bizarre example where he says, and of a kind that's not tolerated among the pagans, which are obviously the people outside the church, don't know Jesus, aren't getting their life transformed by Christ, don't have like scriptures to tell them what to do with their life. For a man has his father's wife. Now, there's a lot of debate about what that even means. It's probably not the verse you put up on your fridge on a Tuesday, but it probably means, I think probably the purest version of it is it's a stepmom. So it's not like the guy's own mom. It might be that. I mean, it might be a way of saying that. Most scholars would say it's a stepmom, someone who's come into the family and the son is sleeping with it. But this is, and to be honest, guys, I mean, I don't know how deep want to go into this. I follow a couple different Instagram accounts that study pornography in our culture. You've probably heard of the new drug, Fight the New Drug.
Fight the New Drug.
Yeah, it's
phenomenal.
Great. Because it tells stories, it tells stats, it tells how to get over all of that. And so one of the articles that I read a while ago, I just thought of this right now, talked about how one of the top 2 or 3 things searched on porn sites is exactly this. It's step parents and all that. It's so sick. And Paul's going, not even pagans. Well, now actually pagans are doing that. But it's like, guys, what are you doing? You say you're Christians, and yet you're living this sexual, immoral life. You gotta stop doing that. Don't you understand? Of course, he's going to get into this in chapter 6 too, that the sexual reality of your life is preaching the gospel to the world at every moment. Remember in Ephesians 5 when he says marriage is a picture of the gospel to the world. And when you're married and you stay faithful, even when things aren't always easy, when you don't feel really great about yourself, but you stay married because of the covenant that you made, that's a sermon to the world about what God does with us. That's what Jesus Christ does with the world as he pursues the church, even though they cheat on him every day. The same thing Paul says is true about sexuality. What you do with your body it's a picture of what you're saying to the world about God and faithfulness and how satisfied you are in him. That great John Piper line, God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. And I think the place of our sexuality is a place where we show the world that we're not satisfied in him. We show the world that we need satisfaction in all these other ways. And it's like the world goes, okay, see, because God isn't everything to them. And of course, if sexuality, which is obviously a massive title and how it ties into our identity, and of course it does, but we live in a culture that has made sex as God. So much to a point that if you can't figure out your sexuality, everything about your identity and joy and happiness in this individual life is about your sexuality. If that's true, of course, then Jesus' life is a tragedy because, of course, Jesus Christ never had sex. He never was married. Even marriage gets pumped up in our culture as the ultimate. We've made this mistake as pastors, right? You meet people and they're young or maybe they're not so young. They're 30 now and you just say that dumb thing, like, so you're gonna get married soon? Or like, you're just like, oh gosh. Like, maybe that's not everyone's call in life. And we elevate family to this great thing. And it's like, Jesus never got married, never had kids. So is his life a tragedy? So we all would look to Jesus and we go, okay, how does he define reality, identity, sexuality for us? And then he says in verse 2, and you are arrogant. So he names this other thing. So you're sexually perverse and you have this arrogant problem. You have this pride problem. You're jerks. And I know this is not relevant right now to how Christians are acting in the world, but an arrogance problem might be something that we should park on here in our devos and go, man, Paul really doesn't like the arrogant spirit of the church in the world. And I think we lose the plot sometimes when we start to use our social media or our conversations or our bumper stickers or our whatever to come across as arrogant people who figured everything out. And we make the mistake of thinking that fighting a culture war over these things is the same as actually doing gospel ministry. And it's not. And so we come across, it was interesting. So down here in verse 9, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. When you're people of truth, sometimes you can get arrogant because you feel like you've got the truth. And then the truth starts to feed into the way you talk to people. And I remember my wife and I were at a party recently and we were talking to someone and they just like so believed this idea, right? And I won't say what the idea is because it'll distract us, but use your imagination. And we were blind because we couldn't see it. Okay, we were the blind ones. God has shown me special revelation. And the fact that you don't know this, you're blind. You're the only person out of anybody in our area that doesn't believe in any of this. And we're just sitting there and we just said, hey, just so you know, like, you sound arrogant. And we said those words and of course, boom, it all blew up. You don't say that as a Canadian, right? And so I sound arrogant and the party went crazy and, it's like, but it's like, we weren't even saying a value statement. It was just true. It was just a fact. It was like, you sound arrogant as you're talking. And we got to have some self-awareness of that. When we talk to people, even when we say something that's true, like Jesus is the only way to heaven.
Yes.
People will go, well, that sounds arrogant. And you're like, yeah, totally. But I don't want to say it in an arrogant way because maybe there's another word. It sounds exclusivist. It sounds, whatever. But arrogance, a puffiness, I'm better than you, that kind of mentality, especially within Christians, needs to be expunged just as much as the sexual sin. And I know we love to rant about the sexual stuff constantly. But some of the people ranting against all the sexual sin in the world are the most arrogant people in it. And literally, it's the next verse. Hey, and also, sleeping with your stepmom, really bad. Also, you know what's bad? Being arrogant. So you calm down. All right, so ought you not rather to mourn? I love that. I never would have, this is why Paul's so brilliant. I never would have written, hey, I just pointed out 2 big sins in your life, you should mourn. I love that because he goes, not like, should this make you defensive? Not, it's doesn't this make you cry? That you're like this? Doesn't this suck for you? Like I think I can't remember what psalm it is. There's a psalm that says like, my eyes well up with tears when they disobey the law of God. And it's like, when you look out at a culture that disobeys the law of God, or you look at your own church and you see people sin, is it not just, man, I wish they would stop sinning? Does it actually like kind of rupture you a bit? And you're just like, this actually makes me sad. Like it makes me cry. Like this is what he's saying. Isn't this making you mourn? And then he says, let him who has done this be removed from among you. Now this is where things get dicey. Okay, so let me take 3 phrases here that are all kind of saying the same thing, right? The one Curt alluded to. So we have be removed from you. Then he goes on about some stuff. And then in verse 5, he says, you're to deliver, this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. And then verse 9, in my letter, I wrote to you not to associate with sexually immoral people. So it's like, it's this big idea of you're going to remove someone from fellowship in a sense. Man, that like Curt said, are you going to have a day where it's like, it's dedication day. You dedicate your family, you dedicate your babies, and we dedicate this group over here has been sitting here quiet to Satan and hope that things work out for them and make sure we do it at all the services. Can you guys come back? By the way, we have 4. Okay, so great. So it's like, okay, is that what he's talking about? Right? Probably not. But let's just admit the weirdness of the concept of removing sinful Christians from among the church. It plays a little arrogant. It plays a little. There's law issues now in the 2021. You get sued for this, and so you have to be very careful and figure out what it means. And I think what it means, it certainly has the spirit of, we have to think about the purity and the witness of the church, right? And so if I've had worship leaders where I've had to say, yeah, I heard you have been texting girls stuff and been doing stuff, like, I can't have you leading worship, right? And it's like, why, what about all the rich people? And it's like, okay, true. Yes, there are greedy people, but it's harder. Some sins, they're not worse, they're just easier to kind of identify, right? Like, I know when I woke up, if I woke up beside a woman who wasn't my wife, not when I woke up, but if I woke up beside a woman who wasn't my wife, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I committed adultery. But when do I become greedy? Right? Like, that's a little more slippery. It's like, oh, was it that car? Well, that car only cost me. So it's like, okay. So he's pointing out this thing. He's saying, if you have someone who is in unrepentant, so you do the stuff in Matthew 18 where you go to them and you say, bro, you got to knock this off. You got to get your life back on. If you're going to claim to still be part of the church, because there's a witness to the world that actually matters. This story is not just about you. It's not just about you and your story and you trying to find out who you are in life and the curvature of your soul and how everybody treats you all the time. We have a whole generation of people deconstructing from Christianity because of the way the church treated them and didn't do this. And I was reading N.T. Wright quote the other day. He's like, it's too easy to blame the church for all the stuff that happens to us. We have to take responsibility for the decisions we make in life. And the church has historically gone, man, there is a witness to the world that needs to be clean and sure here, which is why we need to actually disassociate from you for a while. Now, people might go, that sounds wrong, but think about it this way. Think about all the people, the Christians right now that are being canceled because they found out terrible things about them, right? Like, they've gone back in so-and-so's ministry and we've discovered they were a sexual deviant. Well, now everyone's holding the church accountable for not holding them accountable.
Yes.
Right? They're criticizing us for not going, you know what? You should stop. Get out of here. So what do we do? It's like, okay, so we got to then actually come down on some of this and say, listen, the church has to do this well. Pastors haven't done this well. Leaders haven't done this well. There needs to be love. There needs to be an understanding that if, like the Satan verse says, to come to that point, because I think all those verses are making the same point, you deliver them over and Satan has his way with them for the destruction of the flesh. Why? So that they may be saved. It's the principle, and we know this in our life, that difficulty is what creates a place where we hit rock bottom and we repent. We become the younger brother who's sleeping with the pigs and he has no money and he comes to the end of himself. He goes, I got to go back for a relationship with the Father. And he's saying, in the end, that is the relationship that is the most important thing in the universe. The most important thing in the universe is not for me not to offend you in this moment so you can have a good couple months. It's so that your soul eternally loves Jesus Christ and has forget the good 30 years, 50 years, 60 years on this planet. My job is to help you have a good 60 billion years and a good 60 billion after that and to treasure Jesus more than anything. And that's why the way that we shepherd people that are caught in sin can actually just affirm them. And it's like when your family member's an alcoholic and what's the role you can play? Enable them. You can enable people in their sins so much so when you never call them out for it. And I think about this even among my Christian friends. Like I had a friend the other day call out, like there was a bunch of people telling stories and a couple got kind of wonky. And later he just sat that guy down. He goes, dude, I don't think you should keep telling stories like that. Like, it was offside. It was weird. And so I think the point of it is for this humbling to take place, that Satan would do his work and actually create a kind of difficulty in their life. There would be an isolation in their life that would cause them to repent. Now, let me talk about Satan for just 1 second. I was thinking about this a couple weeks ago. I was talking with a friend of mine who's one of our other pastors who was preaching on a passage, and I was reading a commentary on the book of Revelation. This really blew my mind. I loved it. So this guy named Bruce Millina writes this. He says, Satan is a Persian word, going back to Old Testament theology, that refers to the function and role of an agent whose task it was to test loyalty to the king by bringing forward questions and probing and reporting the loyalty or the disloyalty of a subject to the king, whether that king should actually bring punishment. So what you have is this job title that is about testing loyalty in the world. That in the end, we know that Satan doesn't just do his own thing. He's part of God's sovereign plan. God uses him. He's on a leash. And Satan's task in the end is to almost divide. Think about the temptations of Jesus. What is that? He's trying to figure out the loyalty of Jesus. He's saying, who do you belong to? Do you belong to God, or do you belong to me in the ways of the empires of the world? And Satan's work in all of our lives is to test where in the end does our loyalty fall? Like on the last day, right? When that great day comes and we're standing before God, where does our loyalty fall? And that's what I think Paul is saying here. I hope that Satan can maybe, if you excommunicate this brother for a bit or this sister for a bit, who's unrepentant in their sin, not someone who's going, I gotta try to figure this out. I gotta try to figure this out. Unrepentant, I don't want to listen. Then it's like, let Satan actually have their way with him, because that destruction may save, he says, that his spirit may be saved. And that's the top priority. The story where the guy in Mark gets put through the roof, the paralyzed, he's the paralytic, and his friends bring him under, and he's sitting there and he's paralyzed. And Jesus walks up to him, and Jesus, I love it because Jesus walks up to him and says, your sin is forgiven. And the guy's like, that's not what I'm asking. I'm here to walk again. I never even asked a question about my sin. And it's fascinating to me, Jesus Christ always prioritizes the long-term, deeper need, the need you didn't even know you had, and you never would have chosen. You never would have gone, yep, my sin being forgiven, that's what I want. I want to walk. And he's going, no, I got bigger things to solve in your life. I got to heal your sin first, because you're going to live to 35 and you're just going to die again. But I want you to live in eternity with me. I want you to have pleasure and delight forevermore. And that's what the framework here is. So it sounds mean, but that's only to people who have a super individualistic mindset and a very modernistic, postmodern, temporal mindset that can only think about the next 6 months of their life. They tend to think that's mean, where Paul has a vision for, actually, this is the way people come to faith, is that they come to the end of themselves and they have these moments of awakening where they sense God more than they ever have. And that's what he's hoping this kind of excommunication does for people caught in sexual sin and greed and these things that they won't repent of. So that's what I think the spirit of the text is trying to get to.
Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so here's how I would say, give that same answer in terms of among you and the cultural context of their situation versus ours. We have been Christianized in our culture. Our nomenclature is Christianized. Our institutions have been Christianized. We would not have individual liberties without Christianity. We've been Christianized. So for them, when someone became a Christ follower, I'm coming out of God-fearing, which is I follow the Old Testament, but I'm not circumcised, or I'm coming out of Greek or Roman pagan religion, or I'm coming out of Orthodox Jewish, Jerusalem Jewish religion, and I'm joining this sect that believes that Jesus is the Messiah. The line was super clear. So he's saying, this super clear group, everyone knows who you are. Now, I lived in the South in America here, and I would go, all of my neighbors were Christians, none of them went to church. They were all Christians. You talk to all of them, I'm a Christian. It was the hardest evangelism I ever did. So now, the key question in this passage becomes, how do you handle a Christian who is in denial and rebellion about their sin? Well, there's a bunch of people that they think they're a Christian and they're in denial and rebellion. And we want to handle them with church discipline. That's a different thing. And so it was so much easier for them. It's harder in our context. That's not an excuse. It's just the complexity. You have to understand what's there. They knew who and who was not a follower, super clear.
Yeah.
We're culturally Christianized, so it's a little bit different task.
Yeah.
And what all that does is just emphasize how important it is to be a person who rightly divides the word and thinks about this contextually. So I am going to answer your question, should you have a Go to Satan Sunday at your church? Let me just be really, really clear, and I might repeat a couple of things that Mark said here, but how does Paul deal with a Christian who's in denial or justifying clear sexual sin? By the way, this is sexual sin. He's not talking about greed here. It's a great explanation, Mark. And Paul does make a distinction. He said sexual sin has a deeper spiritual meaning, just as exactly what Mark said about the narrative of reproduction and sex and intimacy that God uses as a meta-analogy for all of our relationship with Him. It's a different category of sin, and there is a different implication when we sin that sin. Okay, so really clearly, what he's not dealing with, a Christian who has stumbled into sin but is repentant. So if I come to you and I say, man, I see this sin in your life, and you go, you're right, and I agree with you, help me. This passage does not apply to that individual. Unless they're doing that in a false, insincere way, and the secretly in their heart, they're like, I just like this sin.
Yeah, they're playing the game.
They're playing the game.
Yeah.
Then it might apply. But if they're sincerely saying, no, I just need help. Yeah. This also doesn't apply to a non-Christian who does not have to claim to be biblical standards. And I see this happen all the time. Don't cast your Uncle Bud who drinks a bud out of the church. If he wants to come and bring all three of his wives and his pet dog and his chihuahua and everything, you let him come.
Yeah.
And we'll teach him the Bible. This is not that.
Right.
This is for a person who says, I just want to ignore this part of the Bible. I want all the benefits of being in the Christian community, but I want to ignore this part of the Bible. This is who this is for. Okay, how to handle sin in the church, and really how to handle the idol of our age. How to handle this. So the Bible is a lot about idolatry. So we could talk about the doctrinal piece of this being the idolatry of the Corinthian church and the Aphrodite worship cult. And we could talk about the idolatry of our culture right now, which is you are defined by your sexuality more than any other urge or desire or ambition. This is our linchpin. What I feel sexually is my identity. They're one and the same. And it really is an idol issue. So here's how you deal with it. Number one, it's very clear, humility. 2 different times he rebukes them for their arrogance. I think Mark did such a great job. Fault finding and arrogance is often listed with sexual sin and drunkenness. So if I came to the pulpit this weekend all drunk, everyone would turn your Bibles, but I would never preach again.
I love you, man.
I love you. You're the greatest church ever. I'm not going to do that very much, Mark, because people will say, why is Pastor Curt so good at that? I would never preach again if I did that.
Yeah.
And yet if I come with a fault-finding, arrogant, boastful, well, we're so awesome, spirit, people are like, oh, he's a confident leader.
Right.
Humility, humility, humility. It's actually reported among you that you're proud and boastful. Using separation. There is a clear over-nurturing in our culture where we want to go, this person's in deep denial, they're in total disagreement, but we're not willing to do the hard thing of saying, you know what? I've had conversations with people frequently in pastoring, right? I sit down with them saying, we're not just agreeing to disagree here. We are forbidding you to be involved until you repent. And we're doing that out of love for you. And you can't volunteer. We don't want to see you in a service. Now, I'll tell you in a minute how I handle that and what I mean by that. Okay, the third one is with no deferment. Okay, so it's not like we rush into it, but what's happening here is Paul's going, I pronounce judgment on this already. He's saying to them, hurry up. You guys knows what's going on. You know what's going on.
Right.
So don't defer it. This is not the fun part of ministry.
Right.
This is not the fun part of family. But it only gets worse if you defer it. Make the wise, discerning decisions. If you have someone in your life that needs this confrontation, don't put it off. Don't put it off. Don't put it off.
Right.
Get for it. Okay.
That's good.
Here's the next one. With hope of restoration.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to win the argument. I'm trying to win the person. This is clearly the objective of Matthew 18, where Jesus teaches on the same subject. It's clearly the goal of Galatians 6, where Paul teaches even deeper on the attitude in this. Number 5, without minimizing. It's a little bit of yeast, he says, leavens the whole dough. What is he saying there? It's a tiny bit of this compromise spreads and spreads. Don't rationalize, don't minimize, don't say, yeah, it's just that one family. It's just that one situation. Do not minimize. Number 6 was self-examination. So you start with the same measure you're going to use with the person you're confronting with yourself. You look at the whole body. Are we playing favorites here? The big donor doesn't get confronted, but the adolescent kid in the youth ministry does 5 times. No, you start with self-examination. And then within the believing community only, again, back to that point, this is him saying, our reputation as a brand new religion is on the line. And you've got to show the distinction between the Corinthian culture and what's going on in the church. Okay.
And one big distinction to make there too is later on in the verses when he says not to associate with sexually immoral people. The kicker is verse 12. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? It's not those inside the church whom you are. Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. So there's this crazy principle, which is, you know, when people say we're not supposed to judge, he says, no, actually you are, but only the church.
Yeah.
You don't get to judge the culture because the culture doesn't know Jesus yet. So he says, why would I ask you to judge those who don't know Christ in the way that they live sexually? Think about how much we do that. The culture's gone to hell. The culture's a gong show. It's like, yeah, because they don't know Jesus. Why wouldn't they be, man? This isn't like John Stott in his commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, when he's talking about the light and the dark, he says, you know, when you walk into a room and it's pitch black, you don't blame the darkness. You ask the question, where is the light? Salt is supposed to be this preservative thing in that culture, you know, with meat, and it would go bad. You don't smack the meat when it goes bad and go, how dare you meat go bad for being meat? You go, where was the salt to keep this thing preserved?
Yes.
And that it's weird for us to put a Christian, I understand why we do it. We take all of our Christian ethic and morality, we project it at a culture that doesn't even believe in God or follow you, and then we're confused why they don't follow it. And he's going, I'm not asking you to not hang out with sexually immoral people in general. I'm asking you not to hang out with sexually immoral people that call themselves Christians.
It's 100% it. I'll give you a perfect example of this and that has cost the church for 3 decades now. When AIDS was discovered and came to the light in the 70s and 80s, there was 2 responses from the Christian church that dominated. There was many Christians that did many, many good things, but 2 that dominated. And one was, this is God's judgment on people in sexual immorality.
Right.
This is God's, let's look at Romans, let's misapply Romans. Yeah. The point of Romans, the first 3 chapters is we're all sinners and you're the worst of all sinners, not God hates sinners. That's not the point of Romans, it's we're all sinners.
Yeah.
So there was several loud voices within the evangelical community that said, this is God's judgment on sexual immorality, good. Would you think about it? This is horrible. I would like people, because they don't know Christ and are living without Christ, to go to eternity without Christ.
Right.
It's cruel.
Yeah.
Now here's an even worse response to that. When that gets said, I'm not going to say anything against it. And a bunch of the majority of the evangelical community was silent and didn't go. You know, it was kind of like, yeah, maybe God is taking care of this problem. And so I'm not going to say anything. And that silence was a huge wound. If you talk to people in the gay and lesbian lifestyle that lived at that time, they'll go, yeah, you guys had 0 love in the church.
Right.
Now, a few Christians did this. They opened hospices.
Right.
And they said, we'll care for the sick. We don't know how this disease works.
Right. We don't know if we're going to get it.
It's a bad end.
Yeah.
We don't know how but we're going to love on these people because that's what Christ would do.
Right.
What if the whole church had done that? If the whole church had said, we're going to judge sexual sin in our community, but not in yours, and we're just going to love people that get AIDS for whatever 100%. Reason they get AIDS.
100%.
Would we have more credibility on sexual ethics today?
Yes.
Yes, we would.
Yeah.
Now no one wants to listen to the Christian church because we got it wrong
we lost that
in this passage.
Moment. Yeah.
We judged the culture and did not judge ourselves.
Yeah.
When we return to that here and go, okay, so this gets me to my answer. Should you ever go to Satan Day? Here it is.
You really want to hit this. That's the hook, baby. You got to answer it.
Viral.
All right, here we go.
Yes. You should have
What's
a go
the
to
date on Bayside?
Okay,
What's the date?
Let me give a qualifier. Not on Sunday morning, though. Not on Sunday morning. It should be done more like Matthew 18. So Paul knows this community. He's been in this community for 18 months.
Yeah.
He's not recommending, by the way, this is a little funny. People look at this and they want to build a dogma.
Right.
How many other times does he preach go to Satan passages?
Yeah, I would assume, the closest one that I can think of is Jesus in Matthew 18, where his analogy is, you've tried this, treat him like a tax collector.
Yes,
which
that is
the
Matthew
same,
18. Yep.
Same theme here, but I'm going to assume never
Well,
again
I mean,
does Paul do it. Or?
treat him like a tax collector means treat him like someone outside of the body of belief.
Right.
You're practically a non-confessing Christian.
Right, yes.
The way we treat you. This
Yes.
is exactly what Paul is saying here. One passage should not result in a dogma. So we should not be, and people do this. We're gonna have this thing. I know of a kid here in this town, got his girlfriend pregnant, and the pastor wanted him to he was repentant, first of all. Even though he's repentant, the pastor wanted to get him in front of the congregation and tell them all about the sin and why he did it, and tell them that he was, and like shame this kid out of the church.
Right.
So context. Yes, there is a moment where a confessing Christian who does not see their sin needs to be separated. It should not happen in a boastful, prideful, arrogant, or showy way. There's a proper context for it. And no, you shouldn't do it if it's with a repentant Christian,
right,
and or with someone who's confessing sincerely their sin.
And two other points. One is, like you said, it's not Sunday morning, because I remember talking to someone about Matthew 18 and how that works. And of course, the third step is when you have this unrepentant brother and tell it to the church, Jesus says. Well, what does that mean? On a Sunday at Bayside slides, all 10 services? No, it's who's this guy's church, right? Who's this guy's community of believers that are like in his life? Those are the people who are around him that we need to be talking about. Not 10,000 people at multi-site venues.
Susan's showing up for Sunday morning.
So we got Joe. Yeah, those would be the most attended Sundays, though. If we had Sundays where we were listing like 100 people and what they did. Can I give a beautiful picture of what you just said about the kid, though? So I was part of a church before we planted Village that did this. They did this really well. It doesn't sound well on paper, but it was a beautiful moment where it was two youth leaders, so it wasn't just a random kid in the youth group, okay? Two youth leaders got pregnant. Well, I mean, the guy and the girl, she got pregnant. And they came, and it was beautiful because the elders actually, it was probably a church of 400 or 500 people, knew them and had, poured in. And we did a night in the youth thing where they actually got up, they talked about it, they talked about the temptation, they confessed the sin, and then the elders actually came around them, and it was super sweet because it was like prayerful and like grace and like this isn't a thing, and like they'd tell you to this day, now they've got married and have a bunch of kids, they're like, that was beautiful for them. Right. So you can do it in a loving, like, this is actually helpful.
This is not difficult to figure out. The problem is when the arrogance comes in.
Yeah.
You shamed our church. You shamed us, and we're going to shame you back. Problems when the arrogance. I'm going to read the two passages, actually. Then we're going to go to application. Matthew 18, 15 through 18, what we were talking about. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault. So if your brother or sister sins, that's the context. Go and point out their fault just between the two of you, not shaming them. If they listen to you, you have won them over. You're done.
Done.
Period. But if they will not listen, take one or two others. Okay, here's the spirit of this. We are going with more and more credibility as we walk down the path. Hey, it's just me and you. Here's me and the three people that know you the best.
Yeah.
And so that's the pathway we're going to.
Which is that beautiful Old Testament image.
Yes.
From Deuteronomy and all that, where nothing's really true unless there are two or three witnesses.
Which literally what he quotes here, so that every matter, quote, will be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses.
Right.
If they still refuse to listen, tell the church, agree with Mark, that's your church context. And if they refuse to listen, even to that, then treat them like, in effect, you could say it, a non-Christian, a tax collector here. Then he says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What does that mean? That means I can call out to $10,000 to be bound to me? No, what he's saying is the goal here is to preserve and bind the individual to the church. That's the goal here. And he's saying, don't neglect the spiritual aspect of this. Don't neglect this the prayerful lesson. Then let me read one more.
Yeah, and not to over preachify this point, but isn't it so beautiful and ironic that the guy writing this, what did he do for a living? Matthew.
He's a tax collector.
Dude.
I didn't see. That's good.
Right? Like, no, that's jumping off the table.
I hope you could feel that through the camera. Okay, Galatians 6:1. Here's my final word on this.
He's writing that down.
What does Paul really mean in Corinthians? Here he is further in Galatians. Brothers and sisters, again, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should bring them in front of everyone and rebuke them publicly. No, it doesn't say that. You who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. What's the difference between the story I told and the story Mark told? Gentleness.
Yeah.
Gentleness. Yeah. Love. But watch yourselves, or you may also be tempted. And the implication here is in the very same way. Carry each other's burdens. We all deal with compromise and sin. And in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ, which is what? To love each other as we want to be loved. If anyone thinks he is something when they are nothing, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. You start with the measure with yourself. Just the way Paul handles it, so beautiful.
Yeah.
And it is about gentleness, humility. Okay, one thought on applications. Mark, how do they live this out on Monday morning?
Well, I think it's a bit of a wake-up call to the, we can't fall into either pit of, we're never going to call our friends out for their sin. We're just going to exist and hope that they're going to learn to stop sinning because I continue to hang out with them. And, as long as we go for coffee and eat pizza together, they're going to somehow figure out how to change their life because I did this, and never talk to them about it. That can't be the pitfall we fall into, because that would be to ignore a brother's sin. Mm-hmm. And the other pitfall is we're not to be the police of every human being that exists, running around telling them what's wrong with their life. And we're not going to tear around every Christian we know and say, I found this sin out of Betsy, blah, blah, blah. This is stuff that has risen to Paul's, this is stuff that's pretty serious, and it's behavioral, and it's affecting other people's lives, and the reputation's getting out there, and people are starting to talk in the city about this syncretism of the pagan life and Christianity. And as Paul will later go on to say, these two things can't mix, man. We can't have you hammered drunk doing communion. This doesn't work, because
stick with us for a few chapters. We're going there.
Yeah, what's happening? You're turning this thing into this. This is a syncretism between pagan culture and Christian culture. It can't happen. And so we gotta fight for the purity of this thing. And that's gotta be the spirit of it, versus you're going around policing everyone's lives. So don't fall into either of those, I think would be the big idea.
Yeah,
so.
I'd say it the exact same way I just say. There's a bunch of you out there that you're going to be a little bit more like Apostle Paul in Corinthians,
right.
And you're going to go, I've already passed judgment. You need to apply Galatians.
Yeah.
Follow the Spirit and be gentle. There's some of you that are going to be on the side of Galatians. Man, I just want to be gentle and I don't want to get any conflict. Right. You're going to have to channel your inner the Apostle Paul in Corinthians. Yeah. It's a little bit about knowing which side of that you're on. So if you're a little bit like the Corinthian side, add in some Galatians. If you're a little bit like the Galatian side, add in some Corinthians, because you can't avoid it. We got to do it gently. Can't avoid it. Got to do it gently in the church.
Yeah.
All right. We have said more on sex and rebuking people than any other time teaching at Bayside since I've been here, which is awesome. But we're not done. Chapter 6 next week, we're going to go even further into the implications for marriage and singleness and other problems that come up with sexual immorality when it's not dealt with. It's the season of teaching on sex right here at Bayside, so tell someone. In fact, you want to go to our YouTube channel and you want to subscribe. The Bible study's there, and there's a whole bunch of Bayside online content, on-demand content there. So Bayside, YouTube, go look it up and subscribe to that, like, share, and follow. Chapter 6 next week. And Mark, you're going to be here next week, right?
Love it. I'm going to be here. Yeah, let's jump into it.
So Mark
See you then.
and Andrew next week.
Indeed.